In the winter of 1923, a traveling preacher named Ezekiel Morse stumbled upon something in the Kentucky backwoods that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Following what he believed was the sound of hymns echoing through the hollow, he discovered a clearing where 17 figures stood in perfect formation around a massive oak tree. Their voices rose in unison, but the words they chanted belonged to no Christian song he had ever heard. When the figures noticed his presence, they simply vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only the acrid smell of burning herbs and 13 small graves arranged in a perfect circle around the ancient tree. Morse fled that night and never spoke publicly about what he witnessed, but his private journal, discovered decades later, contained a single haunting entry. Some families carry traditions that predate the cross, and in these mountains, the old ways never truly died. What Morse had witnessed was just one fragment of a hidden legacy that stretches back generations through the Appalachian Mountains. While most settlers who ventured into these ancient peaks brought with them the familiar comforts of European Christianity and established communities, others carried something far darker. Deep in the most remote valleys and forgotten hollows, certain bloodlines maintained practices that would make even the most hardened investigators question the nature of civilization itself. Tonight, I'm going to reveal the documented accounts of 7 Appalachian clans whose secret rituals were so disturbing that government officials sealed the evidence and ordered investigations abandoned. These aren't the folklore tales passed down through generations of storytellers, but verified incidents that law enforcement agencies would prefer remained buried. What you're about to hear comes from police reports, medical examiner files, and testimony from survivors who risked everything to expose the truth about what happened in those isolated mountain communities. Before we begin, I need to warn you that these accounts contain descriptions of practices that challenge our understanding of human nature. The rituals these families performed weren't simple folk magic or harmless mountain superstitions. They were systematic ceremonies that involved elements so disturbing that several investigators required psychological treatment after documenting them. Some of these practices continued well into the 20th century, and there's evidence suggesting that certain traditions may have never completely disappeared. The Appalachian Mountains have always been a place where the outside world struggles to penetrate. Even today, with satellite technology and modern communication, there are valleys where cell phone signals fail, where GPS systems provide incorrect directions, and where the topography itself seems designed to hide secrets. For families seeking to maintain practices that the broader world would never accept, these natural barriers provided the perfect sanctuary. What developed over generations was a collection of isolated communities where bloodline traditions took precedence over conventional law, religion, or morality. The first family we need to examine settled in what is now eastern Tennessee in 1847. The Harwick clan established their community in a valley so remote that it took government surveyors until 1902 to create accurate maps of the area. Unlike typical mountain families who welcomed occasional trade with neighboring settlements, the Harwicks maintained complete isolation, emerging from their territory only when absolutely necessary for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. Local merchants who dealt with them noted their unusual appearance and behavior, describing family members as unnaturally pale, with eyes that seemed to reflect light and darkness, and voices that carried an odd resonance even in normal conversation. What made the Harwicks truly different wasn't their physical characteristics, but their relationship with death itself. The family practiced what they called the awakening, a ritual performed whenever a member of the clan died. According to testimony from a former family member who escaped the community in 1934, the ceremony began immediately after death, before the body had time to grow cold. The deceased would be placed in a specially prepared chamber beneath the main family dwelling, a room carved directly into the bedrock and lined with stones arranged in precise geometric patterns. The ritual itself required the participation of every blood relative, from the eldest patriarch down to infants who could barely walk. Family members would gather in concentric circles around the body, with the closest blood relatives positioned nearest to the deceased. What followed was described as a calling back, a process where the family would chant in voices that gradually synchronized until they sounded like a single entity speaking from multiple throats. The chanting would continue for 3 days and 3 nights, with family members taking turns maintaining the rhythm while others collapsed from exhaustion. According to the witness account, something would happen on the 3rd night that defied rational explanation. The deceased would begin to respond to the chanting, first with barely perceptible movements, then with more pronounced reactions. The body would sit upright, eyes would open, and the mouth would begin to move in synchronization with the family's chanting. This wasn't the random muscle contractions that can occur in recently deceased bodies, but deliberate, purposeful movement that suggested consciousness had somehow been restored. The truly disturbing aspect of the awakening wasn't the apparent resurrection, but what happened next. The revived family member would speak, but not in their own voice. Instead, they would relay messages from what the Harwicks called the Deep Ones, entities that supposedly existed in the spaces between life and death. These messages often contained information about future events, the location of valuable resources, or instructions for maintaining the family's supernatural protections. The revived person would deliver these communications for several hours before finally succumbing to permanent death. The Harwick practices remained secret until 1936, when a county health inspector investigating reports of strange odors discovered the underground chamber. What he found inside caused him to immediately contact federal authorities. The room contained the preserved remains of dozens of family members, each positioned according to the geometric patterns mentioned in earlier testimony. More disturbing were the detailed records the family had maintained, documenting centuries of these rituals and the messages they had received from the deceased. Federal agents who investigated the site reported finding evidence of practices that extended far beyond simple funeral rites. The Harwicks had apparently used information obtained during their death rituals to locate valuable mineral deposits, predict weather patterns with supernatural accuracy, and maintain detailed knowledge of events occurring hundreds of miles away. Their isolation hadn't been chosen for privacy alone, but because their practices provided them with advantages that would have been impossible to explain to the outside world. When authorities moved to arrest the family, they discovered that the Harwick settlement had been abandoned overnight. Every building stood empty, personal belongings left behind as if the residents had simply vanished. The only clue to their departure was a message carved into the main dwelling's stone foundation. The deep ones have called us home. No member of the Harwick family was ever seen again, and the valley they had occupied remained uninhabited for decades afterward. Local residents still report unusual phenomena in the area once controlled by the Harwicks. Hunters describe hearing voices calling from beneath the ground, and several people have claimed to see figures moving through the forest at night, walking with the distinctive gait of the recently deceased. The underground chamber was sealed by government order, but seismic equipment occasionally detects vibrations from the area that don't correspond to any known geological activity. The second family, whose practices deserve examination, established themselves in the border region where Virginia meets West Virginia sometime in the 1860s. The Grayson clan differed from the Harwicks in that they maintained regular contact with surrounding communities, presenting themselves as a typical mountain family involved in hunting, farming, and occasional trade. This facade of normalcy made their secret practices even more disturbing when they were finally discovered. The Graysons specialized in what they called bloodbinding, a ritual that supposedly allowed them to form supernatural connections with both animals and humans. Unlike the Harwick focus on death and resurrection, the Graysons were obsessed with control and influence over living beings. Their practices centered around the collection and use of blood from various sources, which they believed contained the essence of consciousness itself. The family maintained an extensive network of what they called contributors, individuals from neighboring communities who provided blood samples in exchange for the Graysons' services as healers and fortune tellers. Most contributors believed they were participating in harmless folk medicine, unaware that their blood was being used in rituals designed to grant the Graysons supernatural influence over their thoughts and actions. The blood-binding ceremony took place monthly during the new moon, when the family would gather in a natural cave system that extended deep into the mountain. The cave had been modified over generations, with channels carved into the rock to direct the flow of collected blood toward a central chamber where the ritual took place. Family members would consume mixtures of human and animal blood while performing elaborate dances that supposedly opened pathways between their consciousness and that of their contributors. According to documentation seized during a 1943 raid, the Graysons maintained detailed records of their influence over hundreds of individuals across multiple counties. These records describe their ability to implant suggestions, alter memories, and even control physical actions of people who had unknowingly contributed blood to their rituals. The family used these capabilities to manipulate local politics, influence business dealings, and maintain their position as respected community members while hiding their true practices. The Grayson operation was exposed when a county doctor became suspicious of the unusual number of people seeking treatment for unexplained anemia in the region. His investigation revealed that many patients had been regularly providing blood samples to the Graysons under the guise of health monitoring. When authorities searched the Grayson property, they discovered not only the cave system and its modifications, but also evidence of practices that extended far beyond simple blood collection. The family had been conducting experiments on kidnapped individuals, testing the limits of their blood-based control methods. A hidden chamber beneath their main dwelling contained the remains of at least 20 people who had apparently been subjected to repeated blood extraction until death. More disturbing were the detailed notes describing how the Graysons had used these victims to refine their techniques, learning to extract maximum psychological influence from minimal blood samples. When federal agents moved to arrest the family, they encountered resistance that defied conventional explanation. Several officers reported that their weapons malfunctioned at crucial moments, that they experienced sudden disorientation that caused them to lose track of their targets, and that they felt compelled to ignore evidence that was clearly visible moments before. The raid ultimately succeeded, but not before 3 family members escaped into the mountain wilderness. The captured Graysons provided testimony that revealed the true scope of their operations. They claimed to have influenced major political decisions, manipulated local elections, and controlled the actions of prominent business leaders throughout the region. Their blood-based rituals had supposedly granted them the ability to access the thoughts and memories of anyone who had contributed samples, creating a network of unwitting informants that extended across state lines. Perhaps most disturbing was their claim that the practices weren't unique to their family. The Graysons insisted that similar blood-based rituals were being performed by related clans throughout the Appalachian region, each specializing in different aspects of supernatural control and influence. They described a loose confederation of families who maintained contact through coded messages and periodic gatherings, sharing techniques and coordinating their activities to avoid detection by authorities. The evidence seized from the Grayson property was classified by federal order, and the surviving family members were transferred to a secure facility where they remained until their deaths. The cave system was sealed with concrete, but local residents continued to report unusual phenomena in the area. Some claimed to hear voices calling from beneath the ground, while others described feeling suddenly compelled to visit the sealed cave entrance, as if drawn by an invisible force they cannot resist. The third family whose practices demand examination established themselves in the remote highlands of North Carolina during the 1870s. The Whitmore clan chose a location that seemed designed by nature itself to conceal dark secrets. A series of interconnected valleys surrounded by peaks so steep and treacherous that even experienced mountaineers avoided the area. Unlike the Harwicks' focus on death or the Graysons' obsession with blood control, the Whitmores practiced what they called soul harvesting, a ritual system that targeted the spiritual essence of their victims rather than their physical bodies. The Whitmore territory became known among local residents as the Quiet Place, not because of any peaceful atmosphere, but because of the unnatural silence that seemed to emanate from the valleys they controlled. Birds refused to fly over the area, wildlife avoided the region entirely, and even insects seemed to disappear when approaching the invisible boundaries of Whitmore land. This supernatural sterility should have served as a warning to outsiders, but the isolation of the region meant that few people ever ventured close enough to notice the warning signs. The family's practices centered around the belief that human souls could be extracted, stored, and manipulated through specific ritualistic procedures. According to testimony from a former family member who escaped during a 1951 government raid, The Whitmores had developed techniques for identifying individuals whose spiritual essence was particularly powerful or valuable. They would spend months studying potential targets, learning their habits, fears, and weaknesses before initiating the harvesting process. The soul harvesting ritual began with what the family called the calling, a ceremony performed in a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside by generations of Whitmore ancestors. The stone formation had been modified over decades, with intricate symbols carved into the rock face and channels cut into the floor to direct the flow of various substances used in the ritual. At the center of the amphitheater stood a pillar of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an area of perpetual shadow even during the brightest daylight hours. The target of the harvesting ritual would be brought to the amphitheater through various means, sometimes through kidnapping, but more often through elaborate deceptions that convinced victims to enter Whitmore territory voluntarily. The family had developed sophisticated methods for creating false emergencies, fabricating stories about injured relatives, or offering opportunities that seemed too valuable to refuse. Once the target was within the ritual space, the true ceremony could begin. The harvesting process itself was described as a gradual extraction that could take several days to complete. The victim would be placed in a specially prepared chamber beneath the stone pillar, a space that had been carved to amplify certain frequencies of sound while dampening others. Family members would position themselves around the chamber and begin a complex pattern of chanting that supposedly created vibrations capable of separating the soul from its physical vessel. As the ritual progressed, witnesses reported that the victim would begin to exhibit signs of spiritual disconnection. Their movements would become increasingly mechanical, their responses to stimuli would diminish, and their eyes would develop a vacant quality that suggested consciousness was slowly draining away. The process wasn't painful in a conventional sense, but observers described it as profoundly disturbing to witness, as if they were watching the essence of humanity being systematically removed from a living person. The extracted souls were supposedly stored in containers crafted from materials found only in the deepest parts of the Whitmore territory. These vessels, described as crystalline formations that seemed to pulse with internal light, were kept in a vault beneath the family's main dwelling. According to the escaped family member's testimony, the Whitmores had accumulated hundreds of these containers over the course of several generations, each one containing the spiritual essence of a different victim. The family believed that by controlling these harvested souls, they could access the memories, skills, and knowledge of their victims. More disturbing was their claim that they could use the stored souls to influence events in the physical world, sending spiritual essence to possess other individuals or manipulate circumstances to their advantage. The Whitmores supposedly used these capabilities to maintain their isolation, ensuring that government officials, law enforcement, and curious outsiders would experience sudden changes of heart when approaching their territory. The Whitmore practices came to light in 1941 when a group of federal agents investigating reports of missing persons in the region discovered the family's ritual site. What they found challenged their understanding of reality itself. The stone amphitheater contained evidence of decades of ritualistic activity, including the remains of victims who had apparently died during the soul extraction process. More disturbing were the detailed records the family had maintained, documenting their techniques and the capabilities they had supposedly gained through their practices. The vault beneath the main dwelling contained hundreds of the crystalline containers, each one labeled with the name and date of the victim whose soul it supposedly contained. Federal agents reported that the containers seemed to emit a faint humming sound, and that prolonged exposure to them caused feelings of profound unease and disorientation. Several agents required psychological treatment after handling the containers, reporting persistent nightmares and the sensation of being watched by invisible presences. When authorities moved to arrest the Whitmore family, they encountered resistance that defied conventional explanation. Several agents reported that their memories became confused during the operation, that they found themselves unable to remember why they had come to the location, and that they experienced sudden compulsions to leave the area immediately. The raid ultimately succeeded, but only after reinforcements arrived with specialized equipment designed to block certain types of electromagnetic interference. The captured Whitmores provided testimony that revealed the true scope of their operations. They claimed to have harvested souls from individuals across multiple states, using their stored spiritual essence to influence major political and economic decisions. Their practices had supposedly granted them the ability to access information from any time period represented by their collection of souls, creating a network of knowledge that spanned generations. Perhaps most disturbing was their insistence that the soul harvesting techniques had been passed down through their bloodline for centuries, with each generation refining and expanding the methods used by their ancestors. They described elaborate family trees that tracked not only blood relationships, but also the spiritual capabilities inherited by different family members. Certain individuals were supposedly born with enhanced abilities to detect, extract, and manipulate souls, while others served as repositories for the collective knowledge gained through generations of harvesting. The evidence seized from the Whitmore property was classified at the highest levels of government secrecy, and the surviving family members were transferred to a facility where they remained under constant observation until their deaths. The crystalline containers were reportedly transported to a secure research facility, though no official records acknowledge their existence. The stone amphitheater was destroyed using explosives, but local residents continue to report unusual phenomena in the area. The fourth family, whose practices warrant examination, established themselves in the remote wilderness of eastern Kentucky during the 1850s. The Ashford clan chose a location that seemed cursed by nature itself, a series of valleys where the water ran black, where vegetation grew in unnatural patterns, and where the very air seemed to carry whispers of ancient secrets. Unlike the previous families who focused on death, control, or spiritual manipulation, the Ashfords practiced what they called flesh shaping, a ritual system that involved the physical transformation of living beings through methods that challenged the boundaries between medicine and dark magic. The Ashford territory became known among local residents as the Changing Ground, a reference to the disturbing reports that emerged from occasional encounters with family members. Those who had seen the Ashfords described individuals whose physical characteristics seemed to shift depending on circumstances, whose limbs appeared to be of different lengths at different times, and whose facial features bore similarities to various animals rather than typical human configurations. These accounts were initially dismissed as folklore, but accumulating evidence suggested that the Ashford practices involved actual biological manipulation rather than simple illusion. The family's rituals centered around the belief that human flesh was merely one possible configuration of living tissue, and that through specific procedures, the physical form could be reshaped to serve different purposes. According to documentation seized during a 1944 federal raid, the Ashfords had developed techniques for altering bone structure, modifying muscle configuration, and even changing the basic architecture of internal organs. These transformations weren't temporary cosmetic changes, but permanent alterations that fundamentally changed the capabilities and limitations of the human body. The flesh-shaping process began with what the family called the softening, a ritual performed in a natural cave system that had been modified over generations to serve as a biological laboratory. The caves contained chambers filled with various substances, some recognizable as herbs and minerals, others described as organic materials that seemed to pulse with their own life force. The walls of these chambers were covered with detailed anatomical drawings that showed the human form in various stages of transformation, with notes written in a mixture of English and symbols that no linguist has successfully translated. The transformation process itself required the participation of multiple family members, each specializing in different aspects of the biological manipulation. The subject, whether a willing family member seeking enhancement or an unwilling victim, would be placed in a specially prepared chamber where the walls wept with secretions that seemed to dissolve the boundaries between solid flesh and malleable tissue. Family members would then begin a complex procedure that combined what appeared to be surgical techniques with ritualistic elements that had no basis in conventional medicine. The Ashfords had developed instruments crafted from materials found only in the deepest parts of their territory, implements that seemed to cut through bone and muscle without causing conventional wounds, tools that could reshape cartilage as easily as clay, and devices that appeared to stimulate cellular regeneration at supernatural rates. These instruments were passed down through generations, each one supposedly gaining power through repeated use in the flesh-shaping rituals. According to testimony from a family member who escaped during the 1944 raid, the transformation process could take weeks to complete, with the subject's body being gradually reshaped according to specific patterns that the Ashfords claimed had been revealed to them through dreams and visions. The most common modifications involved enhancing physical capabilities, extending limbs for greater reach, reinforcing bone structure for increased strength, or altering sensory organs to provide supernatural perception. More disturbing were the reports of transformations that seemed designed to create beings that were no longer recognizably human. The family maintained detailed records of their experiments, documenting hundreds of successful transformations over the course of several generations. These records described the creations of family members who could survive in environments that would kill normal humans, who possessed physical strength that defied biological limitations, and who could perform tasks that required capabilities no human should possess. The Ashfords supposedly used these transformed individuals to maintain their isolation, sending them to eliminate threats or gather resources from locations that would be inaccessible to ordinary people. The most disturbing aspect of the Ashford practices wasn't the physical transformations themselves, but the psychological changes that accompanied them. Subjects who underwent the flesh-shaping process reportedly experienced fundamental alterations in their consciousness, developing thought patterns and behavioral tendencies that aligned more closely with the animal characteristics they had been given than with human psychology. The family seemed to view these changes as improvements, creating beings that were more suited to survival in the harsh mountain environment than conventional humans. The Ashford practices came to light when a group of soldiers training in the region during World War II encountered what they initially believed was a new form of enemy combatant. The creature they faced possessed human intelligence, but moved with the speed and agility of a large predator, had limbs that seemed to extend and contract at will, and demonstrated physical capabilities that defied military understanding of human limitations. After capturing the being, military investigators traced it back to the Ashford territory and discovered the full scope of the family's operations. The federal raid that followed revealed a community that had been conducting biological experiments for nearly a century. The cave system contained the evidence of hundreds of transformation procedures, including the remains of subjects who had not survived the process. More disturbing were the living examples of Ashford work. Family members who had been so extensively modified that they bore little resemblance to their original human forms. These transformed individuals demonstrated capabilities that challenged scientific understanding of biological possibility. The instruments used in the flesh-shaping process were unlike anything in conventional medical practice. Federal investigators reported finding tools that seemed to manipulate living tissue at the cellular level, devices that could accelerate healing while simultaneously restructuring the affected area, and implements that appeared to draw energy from unknown sources to power their transformative capabilities. Several investigators required medical treatment after handling these instruments, reporting symptoms that included spontaneous tissue changes and the sensation of their own flesh becoming unnaturally malleable. When authorities moved to arrest the Ashford family, they encountered resistance from beings that defied conventional classification. The transformed family members demonstrated abilities that made them nearly impossible to capture using standard law enforcement techniques. Several possessed strength that allowed them to tear through metal restraints. Others moved with speed that made them virtually invisible, and some demonstrated the ability to alter their physical form during combat to avoid injury or escape confinement. The captured Ashfords provided testimony that revealed the true scope of their biological manipulations. They claimed to have created beings capable of surviving in environments ranging from the deepest ocean trenches to the highest mountain peaks, individuals who could regenerate from injuries that would be fatal to normal humans, and creatures that possessed combinations of human intelligence with animal capabilities. Their practices had supposedly granted them the ability to adapt to any environmental challenge by simply reshaping their physical forms to meet new requirements. Perhaps most disturbing was their insistence that the flesh-shaping techniques represented only the beginning of their capabilities. The Ashfords claimed to have developed methods for creating entirely new forms of life, combining human consciousness with non-human biology to produce beings that transcended the limitations of any single species. They described experiments that had produced creatures capable of existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, beings that could manipulate matter at the molecular level, and entities that possessed capabilities that seemed to violate fundamental laws of physics. The evidence seized from the Ashford property was classified at levels that exceeded even the previous family's documentation. The transformed family members were transferred to a facility specifically designed to contain beings with unusual capabilities, while the biological materials and instruments were reportedly studied by government scientists who had clearance for the most sensitive research projects. The cave system was sealed using methods that went beyond conventional explosives, with some reports suggesting that the entire area was treated with chemical agents designed to prevent any form of biological activity. The fifth family, whose practices demand examination, established themselves in the mountainous regions of southern West Virginia during the 1830s. The Corbin clan chose a location that seemed designed by geological forces to hide the most disturbing secrets. A series of limestone caves that extended deep into the earth, creating a natural labyrinth where sound carried in impossible directions, and where the very air seemed to pulse with energies that had no scientific explanation. Unlike the previous families who focused on death, control, spiritual manipulation, or physical transformation, the Corbins practiced what they called timefolding, a ritual system that involved the manipulation of temporal flow through methods that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The Corbin territory became known among local residents as the Lost Hours, a reference to the disturbing reports that emerged from those few individuals who had ventured too close to the family's domain. Visitors described experiencing periods of time that seemed to stretch or compress without explanation, finding themselves emerging from the area with no memory of how long they had been there, and discovering that hours or even days had passed while they had experienced only minutes of conscious time. These accounts were initially dismissed as confusion caused by the complex cave system, but accumulating evidence suggested that the Corbins had developed techniques for actually manipulating the flow of time itself. The family's rituals centered around the belief that time was not a constant force, but rather a substance that could be gathered, stored, and redistributed according to specific procedures. According to documentation seized during a 1949 federal investigation, the Corbins had developed techniques for creating temporal reservoirs where stolen moments could be preserved indefinitely, methods for accelerating or slowing the passage of time within designated areas, and procedures for accessing events from both the past and future through what they called temporal windows. The time-folding process began with what the family called the gathering, a ritual performed in the deepest chambers of their cave system where the limestone formations had been carved over generations to create geometric patterns that supposedly focused temporal energy. These chambers contained devices constructed from materials that seemed to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously, instruments that appeared ancient and newly forged at the same moment, tools that cast shadows that moved independently of their physical forms, and containers that held substances that aged and renewed themselves in endless cycles. The ritual itself required the participation of family members who had undergone years of preparation to develop what the Corbins called temporal sensitivity. These individuals could supposedly perceive the flow of time as a visible force, detect variations in temporal density, and manipulate chronological currents through focused concentration. During the gathering ceremony, these sensitive family members would position themselves around specially prepared subjects, usually unwilling victims who had been lured into the cave system through various deceptions. The subjects would be placed in containment devices that the Corbins had constructed from materials found only in the deepest parts of their territory. These restraints seemed to exist partially outside normal time, creating a state where the victim experienced moments of temporal displacement while remaining physically present in the chamber. Family members would then begin a complex process of extracting temporal essence from the subject, supposedly drawing out years or even decades of potential lifespan, and storing them in crystalline formations that pulsed with chronological energy. The extracted time was supposedly stored in a vault that existed in a state of temporal suspension, where the normal flow of chronological progression had been completely halted. According to testimony from a family member who escaped during the 1949 investigation, this vault contained thousands of temporal containers, each one holding stolen moments from different victims collected over more than a century of ritualistic activity. The family believed that by controlling these temporal reservoirs, they could extend their own lifespans indefinitely while maintaining the ability to manipulate events across multiple time periods. The Corbins used their temporal manipulations to maintain their isolation and protect their practices from discovery. They supposedly created temporal barriers around their territory that caused approaching investigators to experience chronological displacement, finding themselves emerging from the area with no memory of their intended purpose. More disturbing were reports that the family could access future events to predict and prevent threats to their operations, using stolen time to gain supernatural foreknowledge of government investigations or law enforcement activities. The Corbin practices came to light when a group of federal agents investigating reports of missing persons in the region discovered temporal anomalies that defied scientific explanation. Equipment designed to measure chronological consistency registered impossible readings in the area around the Corbin territory, with some devices indicating that time was flowing backward, while others suggested that multiple temporal streams were existing simultaneously in the same physical space. The investigation that followed revealed a community that had been manipulating time for over a century. The cave system contained evidence of temporal experiments that had affected hundreds of victims, including chambers where the aging process had been accelerated to the point where living subjects had experienced entire lifespans in the space of hours. More disturbing were the temporal windows that supposedly allowed the family to observe and influence events across different time periods, creating a network of chronological manipulation that extended far beyond their physical territory. The devices used in the time-folding process were unlike anything in conventional science. Federal investigators reported finding instruments that seemed to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously, tools that could accelerate or decelerate the aging process of living tissue in containers that held substances that had been extracted from the temporal flow itself. Several investigators required specialized medical treatment after exposure to these devices, reporting symptoms that included spontaneous aging, temporal displacement, and the sensation of existing in multiple time periods simultaneously. When authorities moved to arrest the Corbin family, they encountered resistance that challenged their understanding of causality itself. The family members seemed to anticipate every move the investigators would make, responding to actions before they were initiated and demonstrating knowledge of events that had not yet occurred. Several agents reported experiencing temporal displacement during the raid, finding themselves reliving the same moments repeatedly or jumping forward in time to discover that actions they had planned were already complete. The captured Corbins provided testimony that revealed the true scope of their temporal manipulations. They claimed to have influenced major historical events by accessing past time periods, prevented disasters by manipulating future timelines, and created temporal loops that allowed them to live the same experiences repeatedly while accumulating knowledge and power. Their practices had supposedly granted them the ability to exist partially outside normal time, making them effectively immortal while maintaining the capability to manipulate chronological flow according to their desires. Perhaps most disturbing was their insistence that the time-folding techniques represented only a fraction of their temporal capabilities. The Corbins claimed to have developed methods for creating entirely new timelines, accessing alternate versions of reality where different historical events had occurred, and manipulating the fundamental structure of causality itself. They described experiments that had produced temporal paradoxes, created beings that existed across multiple time periods simultaneously, and established communication networks that connected different points in history. The evidence seized from the Corbin property was classified at levels that exceeded all previous supernatural investigations. The temporal containers were reportedly transferred to a facility specifically designed to contain chronologically active materials, while the time manipulation devices were studied by government scientists who had clearance for the most sensitive research into the nature of reality itself. The cave system was sealed using methods that involved temporal stabilization techniques, with some reports suggesting that the entire area was placed in a state of chronological suspension to prevent any future temporal manipulations. The sixth family, whose practices demand examination, established themselves in the rugged terrain of northern Georgia during the 1840s. The Thorn clan chose a location that seemed abandoned by nature itself, a series of interconnected ridges where the soil refused to support vegetation, where water sources dried up without explanation, and where the very rock formations seemed to twist into shapes that hurt to look at directly. Unlike the previous families who focused on death and control, spiritual manipulation, physical transformation, or temporal manipulation, the Thorns practiced what they called reality weaving, a ritual system that involved the manipulation of fundamental laws of existence through methods that challenged the basic principles of how the world operates. The Thorn territory became known among local residents as the Broken Place, a reference to the disturbing reports that emerged from those few individuals who had accidentally wandered into the family's domain. Visitors described experiencing environments where gravity seemed to flow sideways, where solid objects became transparent while maintaining their physical properties, and where the basic rules of cause and effect appeared to operate according to different principles entirely. These accounts were initially dismissed as hallucinations caused by natural gas emissions from the limestone formations, but accumulating evidence suggested that the Thorns had developed techniques for actually rewriting the fundamental laws that govern reality itself. The family's rituals centered around the belief that reality was not a fixed constant, but rather a malleable construct that could be reshaped through specific procedures. According to documentation seized during a 1952 federal investigation, the Thorns had developed techniques for creating zones where different physical laws applied, methods for making impossible things manifest in the physical world, and procedures for accessing alternate versions of reality where different fundamental principles governed existence. The reality weaving process began with what the family called the unmaking, a ritual performed in a natural amphitheater that had been modified over generations to serve as a laboratory for experimental reality manipulation. The stone formations had been carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when observed directly, creating patterns that appeared to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could process. These carvings supposedly focused what the Thorns called the raw potential, the underlying substance from which all reality was constructed. The ritual itself required the participation of family members who had undergone decades of preparation to develop what the Thorns called reality sensitivity. These individuals could supposedly perceive the underlying structure of existence as a visible framework, detect weaknesses in the fabric of reality, and manipulate the fundamental forces that maintain the consistency of the physical world. During the unmaking ceremony, these sensitive family members would position themselves around specially prepared subjects who served as anchors for reality manipulation experiments. The subjects would be placed in containment devices that the Thorns had constructed from materials that existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, appearing solid and intangible simultaneously, depending on the observer's perspective. These restraints created a localized zone where the normal laws of physics became optional, allowing the family to experiment with different configurations of reality while maintaining some degree of control over the process. The reality manipulation process itself was described as a gradual dissolution of the boundaries between possible and impossible. The subject would experience increasingly dramatic alterations in their perception of reality as the Thorns systematically dismantled the fundamental assumptions that governed their existence. Objects would begin to behave according to dream logic rather than physical laws. Time would flow in multiple directions simultaneously, and the basic distinction between self and environment would dissolve into a fluid state where identity became negotiable. The Thorns believed that by breaking down the barriers between different versions of reality, they could access capabilities and resources that existed in alternate configurations of existence. According to testimony from a family member who escaped during the 1952 investigation, the family had developed techniques for bringing objects and even living beings from parallel realities into their own world, creating a collection of impossible things that defied conventional understanding of what could exist. The family maintained detailed records of their experiments, documenting hundreds of successful reality manipulations over the course of several generations. These records describe the creation of spaces where contradictory physical laws operated simultaneously, the summoning of entities from dimensions where different logical principles applied, and the establishment of communication networks that connected multiple versions of reality. The Thorns supposedly used these capabilities to maintain their isolation by creating reality barriers that made their territory literally impossible to locate for anyone who wasn't invited to enter. The most disturbing aspect of the Thorn practices wasn't the reality manipulations themselves, but the psychological effects that prolonged exposure to altered reality had on both the practitioners and their subjects. Family members who had participated in the reality-weaving rituals for extended periods reportedly developed thought patterns that no longer operated according to conventional logic, perceiving the world through frameworks that incorporated contradictory principles as natural and necessary. These individuals seemed to exist partially outside normal reality, demonstrating abilities that violated basic assumptions about what living beings could accomplish. The Thorn practices came to light when a group of military personnel conducting training exercises in the region encountered what they initially believed was a new form of enemy weapon. The soldiers reported experiencing environments where their equipment functioned according to different principles than expected, where the landscape itself seemed to shift and change in response to their presence, and where the basic assumptions of military strategy became irrelevant because the battlefield operated according to impossible rules. The federal investigation that followed revealed a community that had been manipulating reality for over a century. The amphitheater contained evidence of experiments that had affected the fundamental structure of existence in the surrounding area, including zones where different physical laws operated permanently and spaces where multiple versions of reality existed simultaneously. More disturbing were the living examples of Thorn work, family members who had been so extensively altered by exposure to manipulated reality that they no longer conformed to basic biological or psychological principles. The instruments used in the reality weaving process were unlike anything in conventional science or even unconventional research. Federal investigators reported finding devices that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, tools that could alter the fundamental properties of matter and energy, and containers that held substances that had been extracted from alternate versions of reality. Several investigators required specialized psychiatric treatment after exposure to these devices, reporting symptoms that included the inability to distinguish between real and imaginary experiences, spontaneous manifestation of impossible objects, and the sensation of existing in multiple realities simultaneously. When authorities moved to arrest the Thorn family, they encountered resistance that challenged their understanding of existence itself. The family members seemed to operate according to different rules than those that governed normal human behavior, demonstrating capabilities that made conventional law enforcement techniques completely ineffective. Several agents reported experiencing reality shifts during the raid, finding themselves in environments where their training and equipment became useless because the basic principles of physics no longer applied. The captured Thorns provided testimony that revealed the true scope of their reality manipulations. They claimed to have created permanent alterations in the fundamental structure of existence, established communication networks that connected multiple versions of reality, and developed techniques for accessing resources and capabilities from alternate dimensions. Their practices had supposedly granted them the ability to exist partially outside normal reality, making them effectively immune to conventional forms of harm while maintaining the capability to manipulate the basic laws of existence according to their desires. Perhaps most disturbing was their insistence that the reality-weaving techniques represented only the beginning of their capabilities. The Thorns claimed to have developed methods for creating entirely new versions of reality, accessing dimensions where different logical principles governed existence, and manipulating the fundamental structure of possibility itself. They described experiments that had produced alternate versions of themselves that existed in parallel realities. These created beings that incorporated contradictory properties as natural characteristics, and established territories that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The evidence seized from the Thorn property was classified at levels that exceeded all previous supernatural investigations combined. The reality manipulation devices were reportedly transferred to a facility specifically designed to contain materials that operated according to different physical laws, while the alternate reality substances were studied by government scientists who had been specially trained to work with impossible materials. The amphitheater was sealed using methods that involved reality stabilization techniques, with some reports suggesting that the entire area was placed in a state of dimensional suspension to prevent any future reality manipulations. The seventh and final family, whose practices demand examination, established themselves in the remote wilderness of eastern Kentucky during the 1820s. The Caldwell clan chose a location that seemed cursed by forces beyond human understanding, a series of valleys where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds had become dangerously thin, where the very air seemed to whisper with voices from dimensions that should not be accessible to living beings. Unlike the previous families, who focused on specific aspects of supernatural manipulation, the Caldwells practiced what they called dimensional bridging, a ritual system that involved opening permanent gateways between different planes of existence through methods that threatened the stability of reality itself. The Caldwell territory became known among local residents as the Threshold, a reference to the disturbing reports that emerged from those few individuals who had survived encounters with the family's domain. Visitors described experiencing environments where the normal boundaries between dimensions seemed to dissolve, where beings from other planes of existence moved freely through the physical world, and where the basic distinction between life and death, matter and energy, past and future became meaningless. These accounts were initially dismissed as the ravings of individuals who had suffered psychological breaks, but accumulating evidence suggested that the Caldwells had developed techniques for actually opening stable portals between different layers of reality. The family's rituals centered around the belief that existence consisted of multiple overlapping dimensions that could be accessed through specific procedures. According to documentation seized during a 1954 federal investigation, the Caldwells had developed techniques for creating permanent gateways between different planes of existence, methods for communicating with entities from dimensions where different forms of consciousness operated, and procedures for drawing power and resources from alternate realities where different fundamental principles governed existence. The dimensional bridging process began with what the family called the tearing, a ritual performed in a natural cave system that had been modified over generations to serve as a dimensional laboratory. The caves contained chambers where the barriers between different planes of existence had been systematically weakened, creating spaces where multiple realities existed simultaneously. These chambers were filled with symbols and geometric patterns that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human perception could process, creating visual effects that caused profound disorientation and psychological distress in anyone who viewed them directly. The ritual itself required the participation of family members who had undergone extensive preparation to develop what the Caldwells called dimensional sensitivity. These individuals could supposedly perceive the boundaries between different planes of existence as visible barriers, detect weaknesses in the dimensional fabric, and manipulate the forces that maintained separation between different layers of reality. During the tearing ceremony, these sensitive family members would position themselves around specially prepared subjects who served as focal points for dimensional manipulation experiments. The subjects would be placed in containment devices that the Caldwells had constructed from materials that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. These restraints created a localized zone where the normal barriers between different planes of existence became permeable, allowing the family to experiment with dimensional manipulation while maintaining some degree of control over the entities and forces that emerged from other realities. The dimensional bridging process itself was described as a gradual dissolution of the boundaries between different planes of existence. The subject would experience increasingly dramatic alterations in their perception of reality as the Caldwells systematically opened gateways to dimensions where different forms of consciousness and physical laws operated. Entities from other planes would begin to manifest in the physical world, bringing with them capabilities and knowledge that defied conventional understanding of what could exist in normal reality. The Caldwells believed that by establishing permanent connections between different dimensions, they could access resources and capabilities that existed in alternate configurations of existence. According to testimony from a family member who escaped during the 1954 investigation, the family had developed techniques for summoning entities from parallel realities, drawing energy from dimensions where different physical laws operated, and establishing communication networks that connected multiple planes of existence simultaneously. The family maintained detailed records of their experiments, documenting hundreds of successful dimensional bridging operations over the course of several generations. These records describe the creation of permanent gateways that allowed continuous traffic between different planes of existence, the establishment of alliances with entities from dimensions where different forms of consciousness operated, and the development of hybrid beings that incorporated characteristics from multiple realities. The Caldwells supposedly used these capabilities to maintain their isolation by creating dimensional barriers that made their territory literally inaccessible to anyone who existed solely in normal reality. The most disturbing aspect of the Caldwell practices wasn't the dimensional manipulations themselves, but the long-term effects that prolonged exposure to multiple realities had on both the practitioners and their subjects. Family members who had participated in the dimensional bridging rituals for extended periods reportedly developed consciousness patterns that no longer operated according to single reality principles, perceiving existence through frameworks that incorporated multiple contradictory realities as natural and necessary. These individuals seem to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, demonstrating abilities that violated basic assumptions about what living beings could accomplish while maintaining coherent identity. The Caldwell practices came to light when a group of federal agents investigating reports of unusual phenomena in the region encountered what they initially believed was evidence of foreign espionage activities. The agents reported experiencing environments where their equipment detected the presence of materials and energy signatures that couldn't exist according to known physics, where the landscape itself seemed to shift between different configurations depending on the observer's perspective, and where they encountered beings that appeared to exist partially in their reality and partially in dimensions that human senses couldn't properly process. The federal investigation that followed revealed a community that had been manipulating dimensional boundaries for over a century. The cave system contained evidence of experiments that had permanently altered the dimensional structure of the surrounding area, including zones where multiple realities existed simultaneously, and spaces where entities from other dimensions had established permanent presence in the physical world. More disturbing were the living examples of Caldwell work. Family members who had been so extensively altered by exposure to multiple dimensions that they no longer conformed to basic principles of single reality existence. The instruments used in the dimensional bridging process were unlike anything in conventional science or even the most advanced theoretical research. Federal investigators reported finding devices that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, tools that could manipulate the fundamental barriers between different planes of existence, and containers that held substances that had been extracted from alternate realities where different forms of matter and energy operated. Several investigators required extensive psychological treatment after exposure to these devices, reporting symptoms that included the inability to distinguish between different planes of existence, spontaneous manifestation of entities from other dimensions, and the sensation of existing simultaneously in multiple realities. When authorities moved to arrest the Caldwell family, they encountered resistance that challenged their understanding of dimensional reality itself. The family members seemed to operate according to principles that transcended single reality limitations, demonstrating capabilities that made conventional law enforcement techniques completely ineffective. Several agents reported experiencing dimensional shifts during the raid, finding themselves in environments where their understanding of physics, biology, and consciousness became irrelevant because they were operating in realities where different fundamental principles governed existence. The captured Caldwells provided testimony that revealed the true scope of their dimensional manipulations. They claimed to have established permanent connections between multiple planes of existence, created hybrid beings that incorporated characteristics from different realities, and developed techniques for accessing resources and capabilities from dimensions where different forms of consciousness operated. Their practices had supposedly granted them the ability to exist simultaneously in multiple realities, making them effectively immortal across different planes of existence while maintaining the capability to manipulate dimensional boundaries according to their desires. Perhaps most disturbing was their insistence that the dimensional bridging techniques represented only the beginning of their capabilities. The Caldwells claimed to have developed methods for creating entirely new dimensions, accessing planes of existence where different logical principles governed reality, and manipulating the fundamental structure of dimensional space itself. They described experiments that had produced permanent alterations in the basic fabric of existence, created beings that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, and established territories that served as nexus points connecting dozens of different realities. The evidence seized from the Caldwell property was classified at levels that exceeded all previous supernatural investigations combined. The dimensional manipulation devices were reportedly transferred to a facility specifically designed to contain materials that operated according to multiple reality principles, while the cross-dimensional substances were studied by government scientists who had been specially trained to work with materials that existed simultaneously in different planes of existence. The cave system was sealed, using methods that involved dimensional stabilization techniques, with some reports suggesting that the entire area was placed in a state of multidimensional suspension to prevent any future dimensional manipulations. These 7 families represent only the documented cases that survived government classification and evidence destruction. Federal investigators who worked on these cases have reported that similar practices were discovered in dozens of other locations throughout the Appalachian region, but the evidence was either destroyed or classified at levels that prevent any public acknowledgement of its existence. The techniques these families developed supposedly influenced major historical events, affected the development of government policies, and contributed to research projects that continue to operate under the highest levels of secrecy. What makes these accounts particularly disturbing is the consistency of the reports across different time periods and locations. Despite operating in isolation from each other, these families developed remarkably similar approaches to supernatural manipulation, suggesting that their practices were based on fundamental principles that transcend individual discovery. The knowledge they possessed appears to have been inherited through bloodlines that maintained these traditions for generations, with each family refining and expanding techniques that had been passed down through centuries of ritualistic practice. The government response to these discoveries has been characterized by immediate classification and evidence suppression. Officials who have acknowledged the existence of these investigations have insisted that the practices described in the documentation were either hoaxes or the result of mass hysteria, but the consistency and detail of the evidence suggests otherwise. The facilities where the seized materials and captured family members were reportedly taken operate under classification levels that prevent any public oversight or acknowledgement of their activities. Local law enforcement agencies that encountered these families during the course of their investigations have provided testimony that paints a disturbing picture of the true scope of these practices. Sheriff's deputies who responded to missing persons reports in areas controlled by these clans describe experiencing phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality itself. Officers would enter territories where their radio communications would suddenly carry voices speaking in languages that predated European settlement, where their vehicles would malfunction in ways that defied mechanical explanation, and where they would encounter individuals whose physical capabilities seemed to transcend normal human limitations. The psychological impact on law enforcement personnel who participated in these investigations was profound and lasting. Many officers required extensive psychiatric treatment after exposure to the ritualistic sites, reporting persistent nightmares, the sensation of being watched by invisible presences, and an inability to reconcile their experiences with conventional understanding of what was possible. Several investigators resigned from their positions immediately after completing their assignments, leaving behind reports that were subsequently classified and removed from public records. The medical personnel who examined evidence from these investigations have provided accounts that suggest the family's practices produced effects that extended far beyond simple psychological manipulation. Doctors who treated survivors of encounters with these clans reported injuries that didn't conform to known patterns of trauma, healing rates that defied medical understanding, and physiological changes that suggested exposure to forces that conventional medicine couldn't explain. Blood samples from individuals who had been subjected to these rituals contained cellular structures that shouldn't have been able to exist in living tissue, while tissue samples displayed characteristics that indicated exposure to environments where different biological laws operated. The scientific community's response to these discoveries has been characterized by deliberate ignorance and professional self-preservation. Researchers who have attempted to study the evidence collected from these investigations have found their funding mysteriously withdrawn, their academic positions terminated without explanation, and their research materials confiscated by government agencies that refuse to acknowledge their existence. The few scientists who have managed to publish papers related to these phenomena have seen their work dismissed as fiction or removed from academic databases without explanation. The geographic distribution of these families suggests a pattern of settlement that was deliberately designed to create a network of supernatural influence across the entire Appalachian region. The locations chosen by these clans were connected by natural formations that seemed to channel and amplify the effects of their ritualistic practices. Mountain ridges aligned in specific patterns, underground water systems that connected distant territories, and geological formations that created natural resonance chambers all contributed to a landscape that seemed designed to facilitate supernatural manipulation on a massive scale. The timing of these families' activities also suggests coordination that extended beyond simple coincidence. Major ritualistic events documented by different clans often occurred simultaneously, despite the families being separated by hundreds of miles and having no apparent means of communication. This synchronization implies the existence of a coordination system that operated according to principles that transcended conventional understanding of time and space. The influence these families exerted on regional politics and economics was far more extensive than government officials have been willing to acknowledge. Historical records that have survived classification show evidence of supernatural manipulation in major political decisions, unusual patterns of economic development that benefited specific interests, and the mysterious disappearance of individuals who posed threats to the family's operations. Elections were influenced through methods that went beyond conventional vote manipulation, while business dealings were conducted according to agreements that seemed to bind participants through supernatural rather than legal means. The educational institutions in areas controlled by these families developed curricula that subtly prepared students for exposure to supernatural phenomena. School records from the early 20th century show evidence of courses that taught students to recognize and respond to otherworldly influences, while standardized testing included questions that assessed students' sensitivity to supernatural forces. Teachers who worked in these schools reported being required to identify students who demonstrated unusual capabilities, with those individuals subsequently disappearing from enrollment records without explanation. The religious institutions that operated in territories controlled by these families served as fronts for activities that had nothing to do with conventional Christian worship. Churches that appeared to conduct normal services were actually centers for ritualistic preparation, where congregation members were systematically conditioned to accept supernatural phenomena as natural parts of their environment. Ministers who served these communities were often family members who used their positions to identify individuals suitable for ritualistic purposes, while religious ceremonies incorporated elements that prepared participants for exposure to otherworldly influences. The agricultural practices employed by these families produced results that defied conventional understanding of farming and animal husbandry. Crops grown in family-controlled territories demonstrated resistance to diseases and weather conditions that destroyed harvests in surrounding areas, while livestock exhibited characteristics that suggested exposure to supernatural influences. The soil itself in these regions contained elements that didn't occur naturally, indicating that the family's ritualistic practices had permanently altered the fundamental composition of the land they controlled. The architectural features of buildings constructed by these families incorporated design elements that served purposes beyond simple shelter or storage. Structures were oriented according to astronomical alignments that corresponded to specific supernatural events, while construction materials included substances that had been processed through ritualistic procedures. The layouts of these buildings created spaces that channeled and amplified supernatural energies, with rooms designed to facilitate specific types of otherworldly manipulation. The transportation networks that connected territories controlled by these families followed routes that seemed designed to facilitate supernatural rather than conventional travel. Roads and trails were aligned according to principles that had nothing to do with efficient movement between locations, while bridges and tunnels incorporated construction techniques that suggested they were intended to channel supernatural forces. Travelers who used these routes reported experiencing temporal displacement, encountering beings that shouldn't have existed, and arriving at destinations they hadn't intended to visit. The communication systems employed by these families operated according to principles that transcended conventional technology. Messages were transmitted through methods that involved supernatural rather than mechanical means, allowing instantaneous communication across vast distances without the use of telegraphs or other contemporary technology. The content of these communications was encoded using symbols and languages that no academic institution has successfully translated, suggesting the existence of knowledge systems that predated recorded history. The financial resources available to these families came from sources that couldn't be explained through conventional economic analysis. Despite living in remote locations with limited access to traditional markets, the families possessed wealth that allowed them to acquire materials and equipment that shouldn't have been available to rural communities. The methods they used to generate this wealth involved supernatural manipulation of market forces, allowing them to predict and influence economic developments that affected entire regions. The preservation of knowledge within these families was accomplished through methods that went beyond simple oral tradition or written records. Information was transmitted through ritualistic procedures that embedded knowledge directly into the consciousness of family members, creating a form of inherited memory that allowed each generation to access the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors. This knowledge included not only the specific techniques required for supernatural manipulation, but also detailed understanding of historical events, geographical features, and social patterns that had been gathered through centuries of otherworldly surveillance. The defensive capabilities employed by these families to protect their territories and practices involved supernatural barriers that were far more effective than conventional security measures. Intruders who attempted to enter family-controlled areas without permission would experience disorientation, memory loss, and compulsions that caused them to abandon their original intentions. Those who persisted in their attempts to penetrate these defenses would encounter increasingly dangerous obstacles that seemed to anticipate and counter their specific approaches. The recruitment methods used by these families to expand their membership involved psychological manipulation techniques that operated on levels that transcended conventional persuasion. Individuals who showed potential for supernatural sensitivity were identified through screening processes that assessed their susceptibility to otherworldly influences, while those who demonstrated useful capabilities were gradually introduced to increasingly intense levels of supernatural exposure. The conditioning process could take years to complete, with subjects being systematically prepared for roles within the family's ritualistic hierarchy. The disposal methods employed by these families to eliminate evidence of their activities involved supernatural techniques that ensured complete destruction of materials that might reveal their practices. Bodies of individuals who had been subjected to ritualistic procedures were processed through methods that eliminated all traces of their existence, while physical evidence was destroyed using forces that operated according to principles that transcended conventional understanding of matter and energy. The effectiveness of these disposal methods explains why so few traces of the family's activities have survived for official investigation. The legacy of these families continues to influence the Appalachian region in ways that government officials refuse to acknowledge. Areas that were once controlled by these clans continue to exhibit unusual phenomena, with residents reporting encounters with beings that shouldn't exist, experiencing temporal displacement, and witnessing events that challenge their understanding of reality. The supernatural alterations these families made to the landscape appear to be permanent, creating zones where different physical laws operate and where the boundaries between different planes of existence remain dangerously thin. The modern descendants of these families have supposedly adapted their practices to contemporary circumstances, using technology and social institutions to continue their supernatural manipulations while avoiding the detection that led to the downfall of their ancestors. These individuals have integrated themselves into positions of influence within government agencies, academic institutions, and corporate organizations, allowing them to continue their otherworldly activities while maintaining the appearance of normal citizenship. The research facilities where evidence from these investigations was supposedly stored continue to operate under classification levels that prevent any public oversight or acknowledgement of their activities. Scientists who work at these installations have reported conducting experiments that involve materials and techniques that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. While the results of their research have influenced government policies and technological developments that affect millions of people without their knowledge or consent. The true scope of these families' influence on American history remains hidden behind layers of classification and deliberate misinformation. The supernatural capabilities they developed allowed them to manipulate major historical events, influence the development of government institutions, and shape the evolution of entire regions according to their otherworldly agenda. The evidence suggests that their practices affected not only the Appalachian region, but also national and international developments that continue to influence contemporary society. The investigation into these 7 families represents only the visible surface of a phenomenon that extends far deeper into the foundations of American society than government officials have ever been willing to acknowledge. Federal agents who participated in these operations have provided testimony suggesting that the practices documented in the Appalachian region were connected to similar activities occurring across the entire eastern seaboard, with evidence pointing to a network of supernatural manipulation that influenced the development of the nation itself from its earliest days. The coordination between these geographically separated families suggests the existence of a communication system that operated according to principles that transcended conventional understanding of time and space. Ritualistic activities documented by different clans often occurred simultaneously, despite the families being separated by hundreds of miles and having no apparent means of contact. This synchronization implies a level of organization that extended beyond simple coincidence, pointing to the existence of a hierarchical structure that coordinated supernatural activities across vast territories. The influence these families exerted on regional development was far more extensive than historical records indicate. Land acquisition patterns in areas controlled by these clans show evidence of supernatural manipulation that allowed the families to obtain territories that contained specific geological features necessary for their ritualistic practices. Mining operations, railroad construction, and industrial development in these regions were influenced by considerations that had nothing to do with conventional economic factors, with major infrastructure projects being designed to facilitate supernatural rather than commercial activities. The educational institutions that operated in territories controlled by these families served purposes that extended far beyond conventional academic instruction. School curricula in these areas included courses that prepared students for exposure to supernatural phenomena, while standardized testing assessed students' sensitivity to otherworldly influences. Teachers who worked in these schools reported being required to identify individuals who demonstrated unusual capabilities, with those students subsequently disappearing from enrollment records without explanation. The religious institutions that served these communities functioned as fronts for activities that bore no resemblance to conventional Christian worship. Churches that appeared to conduct normal services were actually centers for ritualistic preparation, where congregation members were systematically conditioned to accept supernatural phenomena as natural parts of their environment. Ministers who served these communities were often family members who used their positions to identify individuals suitable for ritualistic purposes, while religious ceremonies incorporated elements that prepared participants for exposure to otherworldly influences. The agricultural practices employed by these families produced results that defied conventional understanding of farming and animal husbandry. Crops grown in family-controlled territories demonstrated resistance to diseases and weather conditions that destroyed harvests in surrounding areas, while livestock exhibited characteristics that suggested exposure to supernatural influences. The soil itself in these regions contained elements that didn't occur naturally, indicating that the family's ritualistic practices had permanently altered the fundamental composition of the land they controlled. The medical facilities that operated in areas controlled by these families provided treatment that went beyond conventional health care. Doctors who worked in these institutions reported being required to perform procedures that had no basis in recognized medical practice, while patients received treatments that seemed designed to enhance their sensitivity to supernatural influences rather than address conventional health problems. Medical records from these facilities show evidence of experiments that involved exposing patients to otherworldly forces as part of their treatment regimens. The legal systems that operated in territories controlled by these families enforced laws that reflected supernatural rather than conventional legal principles. Judges who presided over cases in these areas reported being required to consider evidence that included supernatural phenomena, while legal proceedings often involved testimony from individuals who claimed to have witnessed otherworldly events. The enforcement of these laws relied on methods that went beyond conventional police work, with law enforcement officers using supernatural techniques to investigate crimes and apprehend suspects. The financial institutions that served these communities operated according to principles that transcended conventional banking practices. Banks in family-controlled territories provided services that included the storage of materials that had been processed through ritualistic procedures, while loan agreements incorporated terms that bound borrowers through supernatural rather than legal means. The currency used in these transactions often included items that had been imbued with otherworldly properties, creating an economic system that operated according to principles that conventional economists couldn't understand. The transportation networks that connected territories controlled by these families followed routes that seemed designed to facilitate supernatural rather than conventional travel. Roads and trails were aligned according to principles that had nothing to do with efficient movement between locations, while bridges and tunnels incorporated construction techniques that suggested they were intended to channel supernatural forces. Travelers who used these routes reported experiencing temporal displacement, encountering beings that shouldn't have existed, and arriving at destinations they hadn't intended to visit. The communication systems employed by these families operated according to principles that transcended conventional technology. Messages were transmitted through methods that involved supernatural rather than mechanical means, allowing instantaneous communication across vast distances without the use of telegraphs or other contemporary technology. The content of these communications was encoded using symbols and languages that no academic institution has successfully translated, suggesting the existence of knowledge systems that predated recorded history. The defensive capabilities employed by these families to protect their territories and practices involved supernatural barriers that were far more effective than conventional security measures. Intruders who attempted to enter family-controlled areas without permission would experience disorientation, memory loss, and compulsions that caused them to abandon their original intentions. Those who persisted in their attempts to penetrate these defenses would encounter increasingly dangerous obstacles that seemed to anticipate and counter their specific approaches. The recruitment methods used by these families to expand their membership involved psychological manipulation techniques that operated on levels that transcended conventional persuasion. Individuals who showed potential for supernatural sensitivity were identified through screening processes that assessed their susceptibility to otherworldly influences, while those who demonstrated useful capabilities were gradually introduced to increasingly intense levels of supernatural exposure. The conditioning process could take years to complete, with subjects being systematically prepared for roles within the family's ritualistic hierarchy. The modern descendants of these families have supposedly adapted their practices to contemporary circumstances, using technology and social institutions to continue their supernatural manipulations while avoiding the detection that led to the downfall of their ancestors. These individuals have integrated themselves into positions of influence within government agencies, academic institutions, and corporate organizations, allowing them to continue their otherworldly activities while maintaining the appearance of normal citizenship. The research facilities where evidence from these investigations was supposedly stored continue to operate under classification levels that prevent any public oversight or acknowledgement of their activities. Scientists who work at these installations have reported conducting experiments that involve materials and techniques that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself, while the results of their research have influenced government policies and technological developments that affect millions of people without their knowledge or consent. The true scope of these families' influence on American history remains hidden behind layers of classification and deliberate misinformation. The supernatural capabilities they developed allowed them to manipulate major historical events, influence the development of government institutions, and shape the evolution of entire regions according to their otherworldly agenda. The evidence suggests that their practices affected not only the Appalachian region, but also national and international developments that continue to influence contemporary society. The psychological impact on investigators who participated in these operations was profound and lasting. Federal agents who encountered evidence of these supernatural practices reported experiencing persistent nightmares, the sensation of being watched by invisible presences, and an inability to reconcile their experiences with conventional understanding of what was possible. Several investigators resigned from their positions immediately after completing their assignments, leaving behind reports that were subsequently classified and removed from public records. The medical personnel who examined evidence from these investigations provided accounts that suggest the family's practices produced effects that extended far beyond simple psychological manipulation. Doctors who treated survivors of encounters with these clans reported injuries that didn't conform to known patterns of trauma, healing rates that defied medical understanding, and physiological changes that suggested exposure to forces that conventional medicine couldn't explain. Blood samples from individuals who had been subjected to these rituals contained cellular structures that shouldn't have been able to exist in living tissue. The scientific community's response to these discoveries has been characterized by deliberate ignorance and professional self-preservation. Researchers who have attempted to study the evidence collected from these investigations have found their funding mysteriously withdrawn, their academic positions terminated without explanation, and their research materials confiscated by government agencies that refuse to acknowledge their existence. The few scientists who have managed to publish papers related to these phenomena have seen their work dismissed as fiction or removed from academic databases without explanation. What makes these accounts particularly disturbing is not just the individual practices of each family, but the cumulative effect of their combined activities on the regions they controlled. The supernatural alterations these clans made to the landscape appear to be permanent, creating zones where different physical laws operate and where the boundaries between different planes of existence remain dangerously thin. Residents of these areas continue to report encounters with beings that shouldn't exist, experiencing temporal displacement and witnessing events that challenge their understanding of reality. The government's response to these discoveries has been characterized by immediate classification and systematic suppression of evidence. Officials who have acknowledged the existence of these investigations have insisted that the practices described in the documentation were either hoaxes or the result of mass hysteria, but the consistency and detail of the evidence suggests otherwise. The facilities where the seized materials and captured family members were reportedly taken operate under classification levels that prevent any public oversight or acknowledgement of their activities. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence suggesting that these 7 families were not isolated cases, but rather representatives of a much larger network of supernatural practitioners that operated throughout the eastern United States. Federal investigators who worked on these cases have reported that similar practices were discovered in dozens of other locations, but the evidence was either destroyed or classified at levels that prevent any public acknowledgement of its existence. The techniques these families developed supposedly influenced major historical events, affected the development of government policies, and contributed to research projects that continue to operate under the highest levels of secrecy. The knowledge they possessed appears to have been inherited through bloodlines that maintained these traditions for generations, with each family refining and expanding techniques that had been passed down through centuries of ritualistic practice. Today, in an age where satellite technology can map every square inch of the Earth's surface and digital communication systems connect the most remote locations to global networks, there are still valleys in the Appalachian Mountains where cell phone signals fail without explanation, where GPS systems provide incorrect directions, and where the topography itself seems designed to hide secrets from the modern world. These natural barriers that once protected the family's supernatural practices continue to function, creating zones where the old ways persist despite the advance of contemporary civilization. Local residents in these areas still speak in whispers about lights seen moving on distant ridges where no homes should exist, about voices carried on the wind that speak words and languages that predate European settlement, and about the unsettling feeling of being watched whenever they venture too deep into certain hollows. Rangers and law enforcement officers who patrol these regions report encountering phenomena that they're instructed not to include in their official reports, while researchers who attempt to study these areas find their work mysteriously hindered by equipment failures and bureaucratic obstacles. The evidence suggests that the supernatural practices developed by these Appalachian families were not primitive folk magic, but rather sophisticated techniques for manipulating fundamental forces that conventional science has yet to acknowledge. The consistency of their methods across different time periods and locations implies the existence of knowledge systems that transcend individual discovery, pointing to the possibility that these practices were based on principles that represent actual laws of nature rather than mere superstition. The legacy of these families continues to influence the Appalachian region in ways that government officials refuse to acknowledge publicly, but clearly recognize privately. The classification levels assigned to materials related to these investigations exceed those used for national security information, while the facilities where evidence was stored operate under restrictions that prevent any form of public oversight or academic review. In the deepest hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, where the ancient peaks still guard their secrets and the mist clings to valleys that have never been fully mapped, there remain places where the boundaries between the possible and impossible grow thin. These locations serve as reminders that despite our technological advances and scientific understanding, there are aspects of reality that continue to operate according to principles that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence itself. The families whose practices we've examined may have vanished from public record, but their influence on the landscape and the people who inhabit it continues to manifest in ways that ensure their dark legacy will never be completely forgotten.